The discovery. The hiss of escaping oxygen was the worst sound in the universe. Harlo Palmer knew this with absolute certainty as he fumbled with the punctured hose of his enviro suit, his fingers clumsy and already numbing in the biting cold of space. The distant stars offered no warmth through the viewport of his crippled escape pod, just cold pin pricks against the endless void. His breath came in short, panicked bursts that fogged the inside of his helmet as the temperature dropped precipitously. The rhythmic mechanical beeping of the life support system slowed with each passing second like a metronome counting down to his final heartbeat. This sound, steady, predictable, relentless, was the only thing that kept him from screaming into the vacuum that threatened to claim him. 19 years old, and this was how it would end. The irony wasn't lost on him, surviving the destruction of the entire research station only to freeze to death in an escape pod because of a microscopic hull breach. His mind kept returning to the warmth of that fateful day 8 years ago when everything had changed. The humidity of the terraforming dome had clung to his skin like a second layer as he'd wandered through the artificial forest, collecting samples for his mother's xenobiology research. The heat had been almost unbearable, especially in the center of the dome where the temperature regulators struggled against the concentrated solar rays. His mother had warned him not to go too far, but the 11-year-old boy had a knack for selective hearing, especially when it came to rules that limited his exploration. That sweltering afternoon, as sweat trickled down his spine and dampened his faded blue jumpsuit, he'd found the egg, iridescent black with veins of amber pulsing beneath its surface, hot to the touch like a stone that had baked too long in the sun. A sudden jolt yanked Harlo back to his freezing reality as something collided with the escape pod. Not an asteroid, the impact was too controlled. Through the viewport, he glimpsed a sleek shadow against the stars, moving with purpose. The emergency lights flickered, casting an eerie red glow across his frost-covered controls. With what little strength remained in his fingers, he reached for the distress beacon, pressing it again though he knew no help would come this far from the shipping lanes. Then came the sound, a grinding metallic whine followed by the hiss of an airlock engaging. Heat flooded in moments later, a blessed wave that burned his frozen skin and brought tears to his eyes. The outer door of his pod slid open, revealing a silhouette backlit by blinding white light. "You always did have a talent for getting yourself into perfectly avoidable predicaments," said a voice that was simultaneously familiar and utterly alien. The figure stepped forward, revealing a creature that defied conventional categorization. Vex stood nearly 7 feet tall, bipedal but with a sinuous flexibility that no human spine could achieve. His body was covered in scales that shifted between midnight blue and obsidian, catching the emergency lights like oil on water. What had once been tiny vestigial wings had grown into magnificent appendages that now folded elegantly against his back, the membranes between the spines a burnished copper that matched his unblinking, vertical pupil eyes. He wore what appeared to be a custom-fitted flight suit, matte black with silver fastenings that accommodated his unusual physiology. 37 minutes longer and I would have been recovering a corpse rather than a childhood friend. Harlo stared, his mind struggling to reconcile the creature before him with the small, clumsy hatchling he'd hidden in his bedroom closet all those years ago. The image struck him with physical force, Vex as he'd been then, no larger than a house cat, with wings too small for flight and an insatiable appetite for synthetic protein cubes and the occasional illicit scrap of real meat. They'd named him Vex after he'd shredded Harlo's father's favorite chair, leaving the man vexed for weeks. Now this magnificent being filled the cramped confines of the escape pod, with heat radiating from his body like a living furnace. The Sentinel, Harlo managed through chattering teeth, the name coming to him from nowhere and everywhere at once. "They call you the Sentinel." Vex's mouth curled into what might have been a smile, revealing rows of teeth that gleamed like polished daggers. "Among other things." "Yes. Not all of them as complimentary." "The reunion." Vex reached forward with a clawed hand, surprisingly gentle as he disconnected Harlo's damaged helmet. "Can you stand? We need to move quickly. Your pod's beacon has been broadcasting for 3 hours, and we are not the only ones who received the signal." The warmth emanating from Vex was intoxicating after the brutal cold, and Harlo found himself leaning toward it instinctively, like a plant seeking sunlight. With Vex's assistance, he staggered to his feet and threw the airlock into a ship that bore no resemblance to any vessel Harlo had ever seen. The interior was organic, almost alive, with surfaces that seemed to pulse with an inner light. The temperature was significantly higher than human comfort levels, but after nearly freezing to death, Harlo welcomed the oppressive heat. "Your timing is suspiciously perfect," Harlo said, his voice growing stronger as circulation returned painfully to his extremities. The floor beneath his feet was warm, almost hot, as though heated from below. "How did you know where to find me?" Vex moved to a console that appeared to grow out of the wall itself, his claws dancing across controls that responded to his touch with soft chirps. "I've been tracking the Helix Corporation's movements for years. When I received reports of an attack on their primary research station, the same one where your family was stationed, I calculated the most likely escape trajectories." He paused, those copper eyes fixing on Harlo with an intensity that was both familiar and frightening. "I didn't know it would be you specifically, but I hoped." The ship hummed to life around them, the walls vibrating with energy that Harlo could feel in his bones. Through a viewport larger than any he'd seen on a vessel this size, he watched his ruined escape pod drift away, already growing small against the backdrop of stars. The cold of space seemed more distant now, held at bay by both the ship's warmth and the heat radiating from his unexpected savior. "They're all gone," Harlo said, the words falling from his lips like stones. "The entire station. Everyone." The memory of alarms blaring through the corridors, of the station breaking apart around him as he ran for the escape pods, sent a chill through him despite the heat. His worn gray utility pants and thermal undershirt, standard issue for research assistants, still carried the acrid smell of electrical fires and fear sweat. Vex's tail twitched, the only indication of his emotional response. "Not everyone," he said, his voice dropping to a rumble that Harlo felt more than heard. 7 pods ejected before the station's core detonated. 3 have been recovered by Helix security vessels, 2 were destroyed by debris, 1 is unaccounted for. And then there's yours. Hope flared briefly in Harlo's chest, only to be dampened by the grim mathematics. "My parents? Unknown. But Harlo, you need to understand something." Vex turned fully toward him, his massive form blocking the stars. "The attack wasn't random. Helix has been hunting me for years, and they finally figured out where I came from. They weren't destroying evidence, they were looking for something. Or someone." The ship accelerated smoothly, stars stretching into lines around them as they entered FTL travel. The sudden acceleration should have thrown Harlo off his feet, but something in the ship's design neutralized the forces that would normally accompany such a dramatic increase in speed. The temperature in the cabin fluctuated momentarily, rising several degrees before the environmental systems compensated. "You're saying they attacked a research station with over 300 civilians because of you?" Harlo's voice rose, anger temporarily overriding his gratitude. "Because of what you are." "Because of what we both are," Vex replied, unperturbed by Harlo's outburst. "Did you never wonder why your parents were selected for that particular assignment? Why a xenobiologist and a genetic engineer would be stationed on a planet with no indigenous life forms? They weren't studying the local wildlife, Harlo. They were studying you. The sanctuary." The ship dropped out of FTL with the same smoothness with which it had entered, revealing a massive gas giant ringed with debris that might once have been moons. Vex guided the vessel toward what appeared to be a larger piece of this celestial wreckage, an asteroid several kilometers across, pitted and scarred by ancient impacts. As they approached, sections of the rock face slid aside, revealing a hangar bay carved into the asteroid itself. "I don't understand," Harlo said, the heat of confusion and fear rising in his chest. "I'm human. Just human." Vex made a sound that might have been a laugh. "Are you? When was the last time you were sick? Have you ever broken a bone? Do you find it strange that you can hold your breath for nearly 8 minutes without training? That your body temperature runs 3 degrees above the human average?" He guided the ship into the hangar, where other vessels of similar organic design were docked. You're as human as I am a common lizard. Which is to say, not at all. The ship settled onto the hangar floor with barely a tremor, and the walls around them cooled noticeably as the engines powered down. Outside, Harlo could see figures moving, some bipedal like Vex but with significant variations in size and coloration, others with physiologies so alien he couldn't begin to classify them. All stopped to stare as Vex and Harlo emerged from the ship, their expressions unreadable, ranging from surprise to what Harlo could only interpret as fear. "Welcome to the clutch," Vex said, gesturing to the cavernous space around them with a sweep of one wing. "The last refuge of our kind, in this corner of the galaxy." For the next 3 days, Harlo existed in a state of perpetual disorientation, both physical and existential. The asteroid base that Vex called the clutch was a labyrinth of chambers and corridors, some natural and others clearly artificial, all maintained at a temperature that left Harlo in a constant state of mild perspiration. His clothing, the same utility pants and thermal shirt he'd escaped in, clung uncomfortably to his skin, prompting Vex to provide him with new attire, a lightweight jumpsuit made from a material that seemed to regulate temperature, keeping him cool despite the ambient heat. "It's a biological polymer," Vex explained as Harlo examined the strange fabric, which shifted color slightly when touched, from deep blue to a more iridescent azure. "Secreted by the ship mothers and woven by the archivists. It's alive, in a sense. It'll adjust to your body chemistry over time." Harlo had questions, thousands of them, but Vex parceled out information in frustratingly small increments, always promising more answers, "when you're ready." In the meantime, Harlo was given quarters that, while spacious, felt more like a terrarium than a bedroom. The walls exuded moisture that condensed and ran in rivulets to collection basins, keeping the air humid enough that his lips never chapped, but his hair remained perpetually damp at the roots. The bed was a concave depression in the floor, filled with something like sand that retained heat long after he'd risen from it. On the 4th day, as Harlo was attempting to map the accessible sections of the clutch in his mind, alarms began to sound, not the blaring klaxons he was familiar with from the research station, but a series of melodic tones that nonetheless conveyed urgency. The ambient temperature dropped suddenly, as though all heat was being diverted elsewhere. He found Vex in what appeared to be a control center, surrounded by displays showing a fleet of ships approaching the asteroid. "Helix found us faster than anticipated," Vex said without preamble, his scales darkening with what Harlo had come to recognize as concern. "We have perhaps 20 minutes before they're in weapons range." "How?" Harlo asked, the cold dread in his stomach contrasting sharply with the warmth that still permeated the room despite the temperature drop. "How could they have tracked us?" Vex's copper eyes fixed on him with that same unsettling intensity. "They didn't track my ship. They tracked you." With one clawed finger, he indicated a display showing a magnified image of Harlo's neck. There, just below his hairline, was a small scar he'd had for as long as he could remember. "Subdermal transmitter. Standard procedure for all Helix research subjects." The revelation sent a wave of heat flooding through Harlo's body, not the comforting warmth of safety, but the burning flush of betrayal. "My parents knew. They let this happen." "Your parents fought it," Vex corrected, his voice softening slightly. "They were trying to protect you the only way they could, by making themselves indispensable to the program. By staying close." He turned back to the displays, where the approaching fleet grew larger. "But we don't have time for this now. We need to evacuate." The sacrifice. Around them, the clutch had erupted into coordinated chaos. The various beings Harlo had glimpsed over the past days moved with purpose, carrying supplies to ships similar to the one that had rescued him. There was no panic, just the efficient execution of what was clearly a well-rehearsed evacuation plan. "I'll just slow you down," Harlo said, the chill of realization settling in his bones despite the ambient heat. "As long as I have this transmitter, they'll find you wherever we go." "Don't be dramatic," Vex replied, the edge in his voice belied by the gentle pressure of his clawed hand on Harlo's shoulder. "We've removed thousands of Helix transmitters over the years. Yours won't be any different." He guided Harlo toward a corridor he hadn't explored yet. The medics are waiting. The medical chamber was unlike any hospital Harlo had ever seen. Instead of the sterile, cold environments he associated with healthcare, this room was the warmest yet, with surfaces that pulsed with bioluminescence and air thick enough that it felt like breathing soup. The medic, a being similar to Vex but smaller, with scales in shades of green and gold, gestured for Harlo to sit on what appeared to be a chair grown rather than manufactured. "This will be uncomfortable," the medic said, its voice high and musical compared to Vex's rumble. Uncomfortable proved to be a spectacular understatement. The device the medic pressed to Harlo's neck sent fire shooting down his spine, a pain so intense and immediate that the room around him went white. When his vision cleared, Vex was holding him upright, and the medic was examining a small metal object in a container. "Nasty little thing," the medic commented, prodding the transmitter with an instrument. "Newer model, integrated with the nervous system." It looked up at Vex. "He shouldn't be moved for at least an hour." "We don't have an hour," Vex replied, his scales darkening further. Outside, the melodic alarm had increased in tempo. "How long until the fleet reaches us?" 12 minutes, came a voice from the doorway, another of Vex's kind, this one older, its scales dulled to a matte gray and its wings tattered along the edges. It wore what appeared to be ceremonial garments, intricate patterns woven into fabric that shimmered despite the poor lighting. "The evacuation is proceeding, but we will lose at least 30% of our archives and 17% of our population if we maintain current protocols." Vex's tail lashed in what Harlo had learned indicated frustration. "We can't accelerate further without risking ships colliding in the escape corridors." "Unless we create a diversion," the elder said, its gaze settling on Harlo with an expression he couldn't read. "Something to draw their attention while our people escape." The remaining color drained from Vex's scales. "No. Absolutely not. It is the logical course," the elder insisted. "One ship, 2 lives against hundreds. The calculus is clear." "The calculus is never clear when you're one of the variables." Vex snapped, his voice rising to a pitch that made Harlo's recently abused nervous system scream in protest. "There must be another way." The heat in the room seemed to concentrate between the two draconic beings, their argument raising the temperature to levels that left Harlo lightheaded. Through the haze, a thought occurred to him, a memory of his father explaining the research station's defense systems. "What if we gave them what they want?" Harlo interrupted, his voice stronger than he expected. Both Vex and the elder turned to him, their argument momentarily forgotten. "Not me, not you, but what if we gave them the transmitter?" The silence that followed was broken only by the increasingly urgent alarm tones. Then Vex's scales began to ripple with color, brightening from near black to a deep, vibrant blue. "On a decoy ship," he said, understanding dawning. "Programmed to lead them away from the evacuation routes." "It would need to be convincing," the elder said, its own colors shifting slightly toward the warmer end of the spectrum. "They would expect resistance, evasive maneuvers." "Then we'll give them a chase to remember," Vex said, his copper eyes gleaming with renewed purpose. "Elder Nix, continue the evacuation. Harlo and I will prepare the decoy." The legacy. The next few minutes passed in a blur of activity and heat. Despite the medic's protests, Harlo was moved to what Vex called the birthing chamber, a cavernous space where the organic ships were grown rather than built. The air here was almost solid with humidity, and the walls pulsed with a biological rhythm that made Harlo's skin crawl and his recently removed implant site throb. "We need something fast, maneuverable, but ultimately disposable," Vex explained as they moved between what looked like ship embryos in various stages of development. "And we need to convince Helix that you're aboard." They settled on a vessel barely larger than an escape pod, its systems rudimentary but functional. The ship's bioengineers, beings that reminded Harlo of insects more than reptiles, worked with frightening speed, integrating the transmitter into the ship's nervous system and programming a flight path that would lead the Helix fleet on a merry chase through a nearby asteroid field before disappearing into a region of space known for its navigational hazards. 7 minutes until they're in weapons range, announced a voice over what passed for the clutch's communication system. Around them, the evacuation continued, more orderly than Harlo would have expected given the circumstances. There was none of the frantic energy he'd experienced during the research station's destruction, just the quiet, efficient movement of beings who had done this before and expected to do it again. The decoy ship was ready in record time, its systems humming with artificial life as it was moved to a launch tube separate from the main evacuation corridors. Vex oversaw the final preparations, his tail twitching with nervous energy that belied his outward calm. "It's too simple," Harlo said, watching as the engineers made final adjustments to the ship's guidance systems. "Helix won't fall for it." "They don't need to fall for it completely," Vex replied, his scales rippling with subtle color changes that Harlo was beginning to interpret as complex emotional states. "They just need to hesitate long enough for our people to get clear." He turned to face Harlo fully, his massive form radiating heat that was both comforting and overwhelming in the already sweltering chamber. "Once the decoy is away, you and I will take my ship and rendezvous with the others at the gathering point." A shudder ran through the clutch, the first physical indication that the Helix fleet was close enough to affect them. The temperature dropped several degrees as power was diverted to defensive systems, leaving Harlo grateful for the adaptive jumpsuit that now clung to his body like a second skin. "Launch sequence initiated," came the announcement. "All remaining personnel to evacuation vessels." The decoy ship slid into its launch tube with a sound like flesh moving against flesh, a noise that raised the hair on Harlo's arms despite the heat. On the monitors around them, they watched as it shot away from the asteroid, its trajectory erratic enough to appear desperate but controlled enough to be believable. "They're following," someone called out, relieved. On the displays, the Helix fleet was indeed changing course, pursuing the small vessel with single-minded determination. All but 3 ships. The relief in the chamber evaporated like water on hot stone. 3 Helix warships were still approaching the clutch, evidently unconvinced by their ruse. "Evacuation status," Vex demanded, his scales darkening once more. 82% complete, came the response. "Estimated time to completion, 4 minutes. The warships will be in firing range in 3, another voice added. The temperature in the room plummeted as power was rerouted to the asteroid's minimal defensive capabilities. Harlo shivered, the cold biting through even his adaptive clothing. Around him, Vex's people seemed less affected, though he noticed their movements becoming slightly more sluggish as their reptilian physiologies responded to the dropping temperature. "We need another diversion," Vex said, his breath visible now in the rapidly cooling air. "Something to occupy those 3 ships for just a few minutes." Harlo looked at the monitors, at the 3 warships inexorably approaching, and felt a strange calm settle over him. The cold that had been his enemy in the escape pod now seemed to clear his mind, crystallizing his thoughts into razor-sharp clarity. "Your ship," he said, turning to Vex. "How many weapons does it have?" Vex's copper eyes narrowed. "Enough to be annoying, but not enough to be victorious against 3 warships." "What are you thinking?" "We don't need to win," Harlo replied, the plan forming even as he spoke. "We just need to be irritating enough to hold their attention." He gestured to the displays. "Look at their formation. They're spread too thin. If we can get between them, force them to adjust their firing solutions to avoid hitting each other." Understanding dawned on Vex's face, his scales lightening slightly. "We could buy the evacuation the time it needs." He studied Harlo for a long moment, heat seeming to radiate from his gaze. "It's risky." "Everything about the last 8 years of my life has been risky," Harlo replied with a wry smile. "Why stop now?" The next minutes were a blur of cold preparations and quick goodbyes. The remaining evacuation ships launched in rapid succession, each one carrying a portion of the clutch's population to safety. Vex and Harlo boarded Vex's personal vessel, the same one that had rescued Harlo from his escape pod, and launched on an intercept course with the approaching Helix warships. "Weapons hot," Vex announced as they closed the distance, the organic controls of his ship responding to his touch with eager chirps. The temperature inside the cabin rose dramatically as power flowed to the weapon systems, the ship itself seeming to prepare for battle like a predator anticipating the hunt. "Try not to get killed," Vex said. "You're still recovering from having that transmitter removed." "Try not to miss," Harlo countered, strapping himself into a seat that conformed to his body with uncomfortable intimacy. "I'd hate for my last moments to be watching you embarrass yourself." Vex's mouth curled in what might have been a smile or a grimace. "Just like old times. We never did this in old times, antagonized each other while facing certain doom. I recall differently." Before Harlo could respond, the ship shuddered as Vex fired the first shot, a precisely aimed energy pulse that struck the lead Helix warship just as Vex whipped their vessel into a tight evasive pattern. The counterattack came immediately, a barrage of weapons fire that Vex navigated with preternatural skill, the ship responding to his commands like an extension of his own body. For what felt like hours but was likely only minutes, they danced among the Helix warships, never staying still long enough to present an easy target, firing just enough to maintain the warship's full attention without posing a serious enough threat to warrant their immediate destruction. The cabin temperature fluctuated wildly as the ship's systems worked at maximum capacity, sometimes cool enough that Harlo's breath frosted in the air, other times hot enough that sweat poured from his body in rivers. Evacuation complete, came the transmission that Harlo had been waiting for. "All ships away and entering FTL. You are clear to disengage." "Acknowledged," Vex replied, his voice steady despite the physical strain evident in the tight set of his shoulders. With a series of commands too quick for Harlo to follow, he reprogrammed their flight path, setting a course that would take them away from both the clutch and the pursuing warships. "Hold on to something. This transition will be rough." The ship lurched as Vex executed a maneuver that should have torn a conventional vessel apart, spinning them away from the Helix warships with such acceleration that Harlo felt his consciousness beginning to fade despite the ship's inertial compensation. The last thing he saw before darkness claimed him was Vex's scales glowing with exertion, copper eyes fixed on the controls as stars stretched into lines around them. Harlo awoke to heat, not the oppressive warmth of the clutch or the fluctuating temperature of battle, but the gentle, enveloping heat of safety. He was lying on a surface that cradled his body perfectly, in a room that was unfamiliar yet somehow comforting. The air was warm but not humid, and the light was dim and reddish, easy on eyes that felt as though they'd been closed for too long. "Welcome back to the land of the conscious," said Vex from somewhere to his left. Harlo turned to find his friend seated in what appeared to be a chair designed specifically for his unique physiology, wings draped elegantly over the sides. He wore different clothing now, a simple robe in deep crimson that contrasted strikingly with his blue-black scales. "You've been unconscious for 26 hours. The medics were beginning to place bets on when you'd wake up." Harlo attempted to sit up and immediately regretted it as pain lanced through his head. "Where are we?" "The gathering point," Vex replied, rising with fluid grace to adjust something near Harlo's bed. The pain receded slightly. "An old mining colony my people abandoned decades ago. Not comfortable, but defensible." Memory returned in fragments, the escape, the evacuation, their desperate stand against the Helix warships. "The others?" "All safe," Vex assured him. "Our little diversion worked better than anticipated. The Helix fleet is still combing the asteroid field where they lost our signal, convinced we're hiding somewhere among the rocks." Harlo relaxed slightly, sinking back into the cushioning embrace of the bed. "And now?" "Now," Vex said, his scales rippling with what Harlo had come to recognize as anticipation, "we find out who, or what, we really are. Together." He extended a clawed hand, the gesture unmistakably human despite his alien physiology. "Partners?" Harlo reached out, clasping the scaled hand in his own. The heat that passed between them was neither uncomfortable nor alien, but familiar, the warmth of connection, of purpose shared. "Partners." Outside the window of their temporary sanctuary, stars glittered against the void, pinpricks of light in the darkness, cold and distant. But here, in this moment between breaths, Harlo found a different kind of warmth, not the sweltering heat of the terraforming dome where he'd first found Vex's egg, nor the desperate heat of battle, but something steady and enduring. Whatever came next, whatever truth awaited them about their shared origins, they would face it together, the human boy and the dragon he'd raised, reunited against a universe determined to keep them apart. The end.